Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Edward Zwick's film Glory. Now, this is a great Civil War movie. It's about Colonel Robert Gould Shaw and the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, which was the first official all-African-American regiment in the U.S. military. It's a great piece of American history. The 54th was a really, really interesting unit. And I say it's a great piece of American history because it is. Not just African-American history, but American history in general. In part because I think we often think of the Civil War as primarily being fought by white soldiers. And that's not an unfair perception, in that the vast majority of enlisted troops on both sides were white. But once the Union Army, once the U.S. Congress gave permission to raise regiments of African-American soldiers, both freeborn African-American soldiers and escaped slaves, rallied to the cause in numbers far disproportionate to the percentage of the population that they made up. An African-American man in the North was disproportionately likely to volunteer to serve in the Union Army. And I think over the course of the last couple of years of the war, it was something like 108,000 African-American men volunteered to join the U.S. Army. Glory is an interesting movie. I'll say this as a little bit of background, just in terms of my personal history here. When I was in high school, I was an enthusiastic Lost Cause supporter. I believed a lot of neo-Confederate propaganda. I was very much one of those heritage, not hate people. I do have ancestors who fought in the Confederate Army, at least 3 of them, who were in the 64th Virginia Mounted Infantry. And when I got to university, I kind of started to realize that a lot of the stuff that I believed about the Civil War was wrong. Lost Cause propaganda, the Lost Cause myth, is extraordinarily distorted history meant to diminish the significance of slavery in terms of why the Confederacy was fighting, and to diminish the importance of slavery in terms of the motivations of individual Confederate soldiers. Now, if you're interested in more on the history of that, I recommend heading over to Ottenshay Films' channel. He's got a number of videos, including his amazing Checkmate Lincolnites series. It's great stuff, and I highly recommend it. Also, his production values are much, much higher than mine. Of course, since I do all of this for nothing, just out of my own brain and enthusiasm, if he spent $1 on his production values, it'd already be higher than my expenses. But that's neither here nor there. So let's talk Glory. So, Glory, for me, so the thing is, like a lot of historical movies, a lot of Civil War movies especially, there are some just kind of bad parts of Glory. There are some portions where the acting is really, really wooden and everybody is very stiff and awkward. In particular, I'm thinking of the section toward the beginning of the film where Robert Gould Shaw, played by Matthew Broderick, one of my favorite actors, is at his parents' rich person Massachusetts party, and this is the scene where we meet Governor Andrews and Frederick Douglass. the whole party scene is just very bad. Oh, it's bad. It's slow, and it just feels so forced. And I get that part of what they're trying to do is depict the trauma that Gould has gone through because he's just been wounded at the Battle of Antietam, which was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. I think, in fact, one of the days of fighting at Antietam may actually still be the bloodiest day in U.S. history. Although one of the days at Gettysburg might have surpassed it. But Antietam was one of the most horrific battles of a war filled with horrific battles. And so Shaw is traumatized by that. We get that. I'm fine with that. It's still a difficult scene to enjoy. But what we have in the film that I find really interesting, and I'm on the fence about, is that this film is kind of divided into two major storylines. One is Robert Gould Shaw, who becomes commander of the 54th, and is a very interesting guy in his own right. I'm totally cool with that. And Matthew Broderick, again, I love him. Great actor. On the other hand, we have a group of African American soldiers in the 54th, people who have volunteered. And we have Trip, Denzel Washington, amazing actor, again. We have Morgan Freeman. I'm just going to call them by the actors. I'm just going to call them Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman because, yeah. Morgan Freeman, who, as we all know, is God, in fact.
Bruce? I'm God. Bingo!
You've got Thomas. And then you've got, I can't remember the other guy's name. He's an escaped slave with a stutter who's just an amazing marksman. So you've got this group, and this is the sort of core group of enlisted men in the regiment. And so one of the big themes of the movie is ultimately like, how do we learn to, engage with one another across our differences? How does Shaw learn to connect with the men in the 54th over the racial boundaries, over the differences in rank, because all of the officers in the 54th were white. That was one of the rules of the regiment. And all of the enlisted men were black. So how do they learn to overcome the racial gaps? How do they learn to overcome the differences in rank that officially sort of keep them apart in a hierarchical way? And how do they learn to become a cohesive unit? So that's sort of the main thrust of the film. And so in that way, it kind of makes sense to bifurcate the movie in this way. Shaw on one side, the enlisted men on the other. In a way, I would have liked to have seen a movie, as much as I love Matthew Broderick, where Shaw was less central. Because a lot of Shaw's difficulties end up being like, oh, I'm trying to figure out how to navigate this relationship of being a military commander who can't really fraternize with the enlisted personnel, however much I might personally be interested in doing that. I'm not especially confident in being the commander. He was only like 25, I think. 24 maybe when he took command of the 54th. And probably 25 or 26 when he was killed, but I don't know exactly. So he's mid-20s, and they put him in charge of several hundred men. Men who are not especially accepted by much of the rest of the Union Army. So he's navigating all of these really, really difficult tasks, he actually has a personal relationship with Thomas, who he grew up with. And Thomas is not a good soldier. And Shaw is in this sort of weird position. So the Shaw storyline is really good, and I actually like it quite a bit. But, and part of the reason I suspect that he gets so much time is because he left a lot of letters. And so we actually know a good amount about Shaw as a person. But I actually think the scenes with the enlisted men, a lot of which take place in their tent or around their campfires and things like this, are more interesting. And like Attaché films, in his in one of his videos, his third video about how to fix the movie Gettysburg, he challenges the internet to cut it down into a fan version just about the 20th Maine, because he says the people are more interesting. The people of a regiment are more interesting. And I think that's what we get with Glory as well, is that Morgan Freeman, Denzel Washington, Thomas, and the guy with the stutter, their interactions and their attempts to navigate military discipline, a racist society, to figure out how to make their own participation in this war meaningful, etc., etc. Those things are really fascinating. And I think if we had a movie that had centered maybe 3/4 on them, with Shaw sort of giving us a frame, maybe, I think it would have been a more... And again, I'm not knocking Glory, because I really do like the movie. I think it would have been a more interesting movie, and I think it could have been a masterpiece, honestly, if it had taken that step. So, because that's one of the things I think that's great about the 54th and about the enlisted men in this movie, is they are navigating these complex and difficult points. What does it mean to be in the army? How does this type of discipline compare and contrast with the discipline of being a slave? What kinds of freedom are we fighting for? What is it that we envision? Not that we as the Union Army writ large, but we as the men of this specific regiment who have a unique relationship to slavery. What is it that we envision? How do we prove ourselves, not just to a quite frankly racist Union high command? How do we prove ourselves to ourselves? How do we, the men of the 54th, many of whom are escaped slaves, many of whom have been told overtly, as well as implicitly, throughout their entire lives, that they are less than men, that they are less than human beings. How do they prove to themselves that they are men, that they are equal in courage, in character, in heart? And again, I think Shaw is easy and convenient because we know what he thought, because he wrote it down in letters. But the real inspiring story of the 54th Massachusetts is the inspiring story of the men who fought for a country that, at that point, they were not citizens of. I mean, the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendments had not been passed when the 54th Massachusetts made their famous charge at the Battle of Fort Wagner in 1863. And that's the climax of the movie. They make a heroic attempt to take this fort in the mouth of Charleston Harbor. I think if we had this film, if I had this film to remake, I'll put it that way, I would make those questions and those perspectives the driving force of the film.